Welcome back to the Photaudiography podcast. I'm your host Luke, and today I'll be talking about exposure. So exposure in photography is often referred to as a triangle because there are three main aspects that sort of make up the exposure triangle. These three aspects are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. I'll be covering all these and how they factor into exposure in this podcast. I'm planning on doing a podcast for each of these elements separately to go in more detail and give you more information about them, but I wanted to give an overview of how they all work together to create what we call exposure. So first, let's talk about what a stop of light is, because you'll often hear this term being used. So the term stop refers to a measure of light. So when an amount of light in a scene is doubled, it is increased by one stop. If the amount of light is cut in half, the light is decreased by one stop. You can change how many stops of light you're letting into the camera by changing the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So to begin with, I'll start with the shutter speed. So shutter speed refers to the amount of time that the shutter on your camera opens to allow the sensor to be exposed to light or the scene you're photographing. The longer you allow the shutter to be open, the more light is gathered and the brighter the image will be. However, leaving the shutter open longer will cause any movement that happens when the shutter is open to be blurred. Most cameras have a long exposure of 30 seconds, and cameras may also have what's called a bulb mode, which allows the shutter to be open as long as the shutter button is held down, allowing for exposures longer than 30 seconds. The fastest shutter speeds that most cameras have are 1/4000th of a second or 1/8000th of a second. In general, for shutter speed, I don't like to go lower than 1/100th of a second whenever I'm hand holding my camera and not using a tripod. Also, you want to keep in mind that if you're using a longer zoom lens, you'll want to bump your shutter speed faster because having that longer focal length will increase or magnify any movement that's happening during the shutter being open. The next aspect of exposure I'm going to talk about is aperture, and aperture is the opening on the camera's lens that lets the light in. So different lenses can give you different aperture ranges depending on how the lens is made. Aperture openings are measured in what's called f-stops. The f-stop is the measure of the ratio of the focal length of the lens to the size of the aperture. The smaller the f-stop, the larger the opening, and the larger the number, the smaller the opening. So for example, an f-stop of 1.4 or an aperture of 1.4 will give you a large opening and let in a lot of light, whereas an f-stop of 22 will yield a smaller opening and let in less light. Aperture also controls depth of field, which we'll cover in more detail in the aperture podcast. But aperture, to give you an overview, the smaller the f-stop, the shallower the depth of field will be. And the larger the f-stop, the wider the depth of field will be. So for example, if you're photographing a landscape, you'll want an f-stop of something like 16 to 20 or higher. If you're photographing, let's say, a portrait and you want the focus to be right on the subject's eye, you might want an f-stop of 2.8, let's say, so that you get a nice blurred background but the subject is in focus. The third aspect of exposure that I'm going to talk about is ISO. And ISO is interesting because it's not part of what's called luminous exposure or the amount of light reaching your camera's sensor, but rather acting as if changing the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. And where this comes from is from the film days where there were different film speeds, or the film would be made so that it would be better for different lighting situations. So let's say if you wanted studio portraits, they would normally be taken with something like a 100 ISO film. A lot of general use rolls of film would be 400 because they're good, some indoors, some outdoors, a general all-around good. If you wanted a film that would be better suited for darker situations, you would choose something like an 800 film speed or 800 ISO. Now with digital cameras, it's not the same, and there's some confusion over this, and I'll try to make it as clear as possible, but changing the ISO does not change your sensor's sensitivity to light. What it does is it sort of amplifies the data that's taken from the sensor, and whenever it's processed, it's either amplified or not amplified depending on what ISO is set. And there's different, and I'm not here to debate what ISO is or get into that, but there you can see some debates where people say, oh, you should always shoot at ISO 100 because you can make it brighter in photo editing software, and changing the ISO on your camera really doesn't do anything. And there's people that say that, and then other people say, no, that's not true. I'm not here to debate that. I certainly would say change the ISO on your camera to what you need. You want to keep it as low as possible though, because of something called grain or noise. So the higher your ISO is, the more light it will let in, but the more noisier and the more grainy it will be. And that has to do with the amplification that I was saying about. So the ISO takes the information from the sensor, amplifies it based on the settings, and what I'm saying is that the ISO should be as low as possible so that you get the least amount of noise. And it's not always the case that you want to keep your ISO at 100. Normally I would say set it around 400 and then adjust it from there. To give you an example, think of ISO is a speaker on a stereo. If you have the volume on low, you usually don't hear much. But if you turn the volume way up, even if you don't have any music or anything playing through it, you usually hear some kind of buzzing or static. And that's the same with ISO. If you have it down at 100, the picture is normally clear, you don't see any noise or anything. But if you crank that way up, you're going to see more noise and grain in your photo. Now let's take a look at all three of these aspects working together to get a properly exposed image. So if you're working with an already properly exposed image, but you want to increase the shutter speed by 1 stop to reduce motion blur, either from the subject moving or from camera shake, you'll need to adjust one of the other exposure elements to accommodate the decrease in light, because if you're making your shutter faster, it's opening and closing at a shorter increment of time, letting less light in. Also, let's say you want a shallower depth of field, so you'll have to open your aperture more to, let's say, 2.8. You'll need to make sure that your shutter speed is set high enough and that your ISO is set low enough so that your image is not overexposed, especially if you're outdoors on a sunny day and you want a shallow depth of field. It's very easy to overexpose. So you want to keep all three in balance, and that's why the triangle analogy is shown, because they all have to sort of be in balance in order for it to work properly. Now looking at your camera specifically, using the program mode or the P mode on your camera is a great way to get your feet wet trying your hand at a more manual exposure and getting you out of automatic exposure mode. So the program mode will set the shutter speed and aperture based on what the camera thinks is a proper exposure, and leaves you as the user to decide what the ISO should be set at. You can also try the shutter priority mode, where the camera sets all the exposure elements except for shutter speed and ISO, depending on your settings. Also, try out the aperture priority mode, where the camera sets the shutter speed and you can set the aperture for your preference, and ISO depending on your settings. So I would encourage you to experiment with these modes to get a better handle on how each contributes to the overall exposure of your image. If you're feeling adventurous, try using the manual exposure mode on your camera, and use the light meter on your camera to give yourself a guide for a starting point. Your camera should have a light meter showing if the shot is underexposed or overexposed, using like plus or minus signs or red and green dots or arrows or some other indication. Keep in mind, it's usually easier if you underexpose an image and then lighten it to bring back the lost shadows and dark places. And RAW is much more forgiving if you do not nail the exposure in the camera and need to brighten the image on the computer, versus JPEG, it's a little less forgiving. So just keep those things in mind whenever you're shooting manual exposure. Alright, well hopefully that gave you an overview of how exposure works, and I'll be going more in depth with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO in the upcoming 3 podcasts, so keep on the lookout for when those come out, and I'll see you later, Shutterbugs.